Guys, you know I got to give you the YouTube spiel, right? If you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be pumping out way more content here soon. Even drop a comment down below. I love hearing from you guys. And if you feel so inclined, maybe even share the video with someone else you may think would enjoy it. I appreciate you guys watching, and thank you for taking a closer look with us. So, your book, Murmuring Against Moses, loved it, found it convincing and refreshing because, as you know, I'm studying at Hebrew Union College, and so all the scholarship I'm engaging with on the Pentateuch, they all want to rip it apart. They want to date it pretty late, sometime late into the Persian period, sometime even into the Hellenistic era. And you guys argued not only for the unity of the Pentateuch, but its antiquity as well.
Indeed.
And you did so not by appealing to theology, but by using the same scholarly methods. That these critical scholars do. Indeed. So I love that. I thought a good way to start out would be, can you take 5 to 10 minutes maybe explaining, very simply what the documentary hypothesis is? Because I want this to be edifying for everyone, and I know a lot of people out there may not be familiar with source criticism and all this academic stuff.
Right.
So maybe 5-10 minutes, outlining the documentary hypothesis, how scholars look at the Pentateuch, and then the arguments that you and Dr. Morrow make in your book. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. So first of all, let's just talk about the documentary hypothesis, what it is. So, the Jewish and Christian traditional understanding of the composition of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was very commonsensical. The scriptures itself talks about Moses writing down the laws that God revealed to him on Sinai and delivering speeches to the people of Israel. And so the traditional view, very commonsensical, most of the book must have been composed by Moses or by people close to him, maybe Joshua helping out, things like that. With the rise of the Enlightenment and the rise of a culture within Western academic circles of a kind of a non-religious, kind of atheistic view of reality, excluding the supernatural. There were increasing attempts to explain the Bible in the composition of the Bible in an alternative way that excluded divine revelation and oftentimes traditional authorship of biblical figures who are often relegated to a position of like a legendary status or even just like a myth, fictional. Right. So what developed in Western universities in Europe from the, let's say the 1700s through the late 1800s was a way of looking at the composition of Genesis through Deuteronomy, where we're not going to talk about Moses being involved. Instead, we're going to break this document up into 4 parts, and we're going to attribute these different parts to different authors, or at least groups of authors. So the way this theory eventually developed and reached its kind of classic form, the idea is that you start with a writer around the time of Solomon who writes a history, as like a sacred history of the people of Israel, and he always uses the divine name Yahweh. And that's called the J source because J has the Y sound in German, and this comes out of German scholarship for the most part. So the J source, he always uses the divine name Yahweh. And then 100 years later comes another author whose interests are more towards the northern Israelite tribes, and he writes a different version of the same history, always using the divine name Elohim, which means God. Yahweh means the Lord, or we usually translate it that way at least. So now you have 2 kind of semi-rival accounts of the sacred history of the people of Israel. And then along in the time of Josiah comes a writer who writes a big law document and attributes it to Moses, and that's what we know of as Deuteronomy. And then the people of Judah go into exile in Babylon, and when they come back, they're under the leadership of the priests of the Jerusalem temple, and they compose a large document of religious law. This is the bulk of Exodus through Numbers, and that's called the priestly source. And then shortly thereafter, around the time of Ezra, an Ezra-like person takes all of this sacred literature and, in a kind of bumbling fashion, throws it all together, and there you go. We get Genesis through Deuteronomy composed from these 4 different sources. So that's kind of the classic formulation of the documentary hypothesis. As it was put forward by perhaps its most famous proponent, a German scholar by the name of Julius Wellhausen, whose the peak of his career was in the late 1800s. And he taught at the University of Berlin and other universities as well.
Okay, yeah, great. So can you go over a little bit the main arguments that you and Dr. Morrow make against the documentary hypothesis, arguing for the unity, the antiquity of the Pentateuch, and how you can show that the prophets were dependent upon the law. In other words, the Pentateuch was written when the prophets were writing and not the other way around.
Yes, so there's a lot of lines of argument that Dr. Morrow and I present, and they kind of converge. But in the first, the book is basically in 3 parts. And in the first part of the book, Dr. Morrow reviews the whole history of scholarship that's been opposed to the documentary hypothesis. When most people go to graduate school, they get told a story about how the documentary hypothesis was formulated in the late 1800s, and thereafter everybody agreed with it, and it's just been dominant, and there's never really been any problems with it. That's not really a true narrative, okay? Right. Actually, when we actually look at the sources, you find that there's been a counter voice continually from the very beginning, and there's a whole tradition of scholarship that has rejected. And when you add up all the scholars that have rejected the hypothesis, it's actually quite impressive. And the insights that the alternative view has proposed and the data that they've summoned is actually quite convincing in many different ways. So this is a story that tends not to be told for political reasons. And it's kind of ironic, Ryan, because we're in this day and age where we talk about, allowing different voices to speak and having a plurality of voices. Actually isn't so much the case. We're still in a situation where there's strong political and social interests that control most of higher education. Right. And so narratives that don't fit the dominant politically correct narrative just don't get told. So I really see Dr. Morrow and I as trying to tell the story of the marginalized. There have been really literally genius scholars in biblical scholarship over the past 200 years who have had stunning insights into the literary structure and the formation of the Pentateuch. And their stories don't get told because they weren't part of the politically dominant narrative. So in the first third of the book, Dr. Morrow tells this alternative history. And what he points out is that the evidence that the documentary hypothesis was built on is not even considered by hardly anybody anymore to really be convincing. What got the whole ball rolling was the distinction of divine names, for example. Scholars like Jean Astruc in the 1700s and even earlier noticed, for example, that sometimes the Bible uses the name Yahweh for God, which we usually translate Lord, and sometimes it uses the name Elohim, which is more traditionally translated God. And then there are more, uncommon epithets like El Shaddai, the great God, and things like this. And so very naively, these early Enlightenment scholars thought that the same author would never use a different name for God. Well, that's absurd. I mean, most of us Christians pray to Jesus as Jesus, Christ, Lord, and there's slightly different sensations associated. Jesus is a little bit more intimate. Christ is actually a title. It's a little bit more exalted. So is Lord. Lord is a little bit more formal. And so depending on our disposition in prayer and in public speaking, we might use a variety of ways of referring to
Sure.
Jesus Christ, or we'll
Right.
combine Jesus Christ.
Right.
Well, Jesus Christ is like Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God, which is a very common
Right.
epithet. And so the whole idea of trying to identify different authors based on the name that they use for God is kind of absurd on the face of it. And then especially when you compare the Bible to ancient Near Eastern literature of the same time period or older. So we see the use of multiple names for God in virtually all ancient Near Eastern documents. I'm not even sure if there is a single ancient document that only ever uses one name for one of the dominant gods. So in Egypt, for example, the head of their pantheon is known as Amun-Re.
Mm-hmm.
Amun and Re are both names of the sun god that have slightly different backgrounds, but sometimes he's called Re, sometimes he's called Amun. There's other names for him as well as epithets and titles, and oftentimes the names are combined as an Amun-Re, which is like the Lord God or like Jesus Christ. And you find this all through ancient Near Eastern literature. So this points out a very interesting thing, Ryan, and that is that the whole theory was formulated before we had good access to a wide variety of contemporary ancient Near Eastern documents.
Right.
So the kind of principles for separating out these different sources were developed before we had really soaked in things like the Mesopotamian mythological tales of the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis epic or the ancient Egyptian literature. And so Dr. Morrow shows that the alternative scholarship has really taken into account this ancient Near Eastern data and shown that, hey, since duplicate variant accounts of the same events are not uncommon in other ancient Near Eastern literature, since multiple divine names are very common in other ancient Near Eastern literature, the criteria that were used for dividing out these sources in the development of the documentary hypothesis really don't hold water anymore in light of the evidence that we have of ancient Near Eastern literary practices.
Right.
So that's the argument he makes in the first third of the book. Now, in the middle third of the book, that's my contribution, my 3 chapters. And what I show there is the Pentateuch cannot possibly be as young as either Wellhausen or contemporary scholars argue. They say that the Pentateuch is, put together in the time of Ezra, basically about 450 BC, maybe even later, as you mentioned, maybe even into the Hellenistic period. The problem with that is, if you actually look at the genuine literature that we have from this period, which we generally call it the post-exilic period, or Second Temple Judaism, it's sometimes called because a second temple was built when the Jews came back from Babylon, the first temple being built by Solomon. So this term post-exilic or Second Temple, it's basically from the time when the Jews returned from Babylon until the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70. In this time period, virtually all the literature that the Jews produced in this time period shows extreme adherence to the city of Jerusalem, usually called Zion, which had a certain kind of a sacred sense to it as an alternative name for Jerusalem. And all of this literature shows great loyalty to God's covenant with David and the expectation that the son of David will return and that the son of David will rule from Jerusalem. This is, what we call the messianic expectation. And the interesting thing, Ryan, and really, the astounding fact that is buried and not, something that's just not talked about in the academy, is that the only part of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that completely lacks any emphasis on Jerusalem, Zion, David, or what we call the Davidic covenant, is the books of Moses, the Pentateuch. Okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, there is no hint aside from, say, Genesis 49, 10, and 11, which are the blessing of Jacob to Judah that mentions that Jacob will receive the scepter at some, Judah will receive the scepter at some point. So a few verses and a little prophetic oracle there. Outside of that, Jerusalem is never mentioned in the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. That is astounding. It's never mentioned,
right?
Even when there's an opportunity to do so, because clearly later tradition understood that, for example, in Genesis 22, that Isaac was being sacrificed at the location where the temple would be later built. That was universal tradition, especially by the time of the post-exilic period. And yet, in the text of Genesis 22, there's not even a little gloss, not even a little editorial comment that this location is actually Jerusalem. Again, in Genesis 14, you have a great opportunity to mention Jerusalem there because Melchizedek comes from Salem, which is an archaic name for the city of Jerusalem. Great opportunity for a little editorial comment. Hey, this is Jerusalem, etc. Right. Nothing like that. Instead, the narrative of Genesis through Deuteronomy puts great attention, especially on the figure of Joseph, who ends up kind of being the climactic hero of the book of Genesis. And then later, when after the death of Moses hands over the leadership of Israel to Joshua, who is of the tribe of Ephraim, so a descendant of Joseph. And so the real emphasis of the Pentateuch is on Joseph and the tribes that descend from him. Ephraim and Manasseh are the two sons of Joseph that get the crossed hand blessing from Jacob in Genesis 48, which really leads you to believe that they are going to be the primary recipients of the patriarchal blessing going forward. And so if all you have from is the Pentateuch, that's what you would expect, that Ephraim and Manasseh are going to be at the center of salvation history from thereafter. And indeed, as we read on in the Pentateuch, they do have an important role, but then there's kind of a surprising twist. We have the figure of David who arises, and then we have a shift to the tribe of Judah. It can make sense, looking back on certain things that are said in the Pentateuch, but it's kind of implicit and kind of latent. It's not really obvious. Right. And so it goes. And so the problem, Ryan, is, and this is not, this problem is just ignored. And I have brought this up at professional academic conferences, and what I get from other scholars is a deer in the headlights kind of look. Wow. They really have no response. They can't say anything. And that is, if the Pentateuch is, as is commonly promoted, essentially the editorial product of the priests in Jerusalem in the post-exilic period, why do they say nothing about their temple, which is supposedly what they're fixated on? The word temple does not even occur in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Nothing in Genesis Deuteronomy commands the building of a temple. It's actually all focused on the building of the tabernacle, which is a different word and a different structure and has a different design than the temple. That potentially undermines the Jerusalem temple. The fact that Moses didn't command a temple to be built, and that in fact he commanded this portable tent shrine to be built in the wilderness. If you could potentially take that in the wrong way and say, hey, that undermines the theology of the Jerusalem temple because Moses never commanded that. That problem is actually addressed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What the Essenes do is they write a document attributed to Moses that has Moses commanding a temple and laying it all out. And that's called 11Q Temple. Right. So you can see that they felt the need to have Mosaic authorization for the Jerusalem temple, something that was lacking in the actual Pentateuch that we have. So I point this out in the book and in my chapters, and so I make that point, the lack of the Zion theology, which really shows that the Pentateuch cannot have been the product of Second Temple Judaism. And another thing I show, which points in the same direction, is that the great prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who are prophesying at the end of the temple period, while the temple is still standing, and they both lived through the destruction of the temple. They began their lives and their careers at the end of the monarchy, and then they watched the Davidic monarchy be, apparently extinguished in the exile and so on. So in the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, when you look carefully at their writings, they are constantly using the language of the Pentateuch. Now, Wellhausen and the other scholars from the Enlightenment, they missed this because they were expecting like direct quotes in a Western style. Well, that's virtually unheard of in ancient Near Eastern literature. Scarcely anybody uses direct quotation. That's a bit of a later development. What you do find in ancient Near Eastern literature, as well as in the Bible, is the unmarked reuse of earlier texts. Typically, ancient authors would just borrow language without attribution. We would consider this plagiarism in a sense nowadays, but it really wasn't. Because they expected their listeners or their readers to recognize the allusions. And so all through Jeremiah and Ezekiel, virtually in every chapter of both those prophets, you have a constant interaction with the language of the books of Moses. And so you find, verbatim phrases sometimes, or more often phrases reused with variation. And so somebody could say, oh, well, okay, so there's a lot of literary reuse between the Pentateuch and the prophets. Why can't it be that the Pentateuch is using the prophets? And indeed, when Wellhausen noticed things like this, that's what he would argue.
Right.
He'd say, oh, yeah, we've got this shared vocabulary. This shows that the Pentateuch is actually written after the prophets, kind of in a bass-ackwards way. The problem with that, Ryan, is that, many problems with that, but I'll try to keep it simple.
Okay. The criterion of conflation, I think, would be a good thing to touch on, because that was extremely convincing. Yeah,
this is what I want to touch on. So when we read in the Pentateuch, there is a change in literary style between, say, Exodus through Numbers into the book of Deuteronomy. It's, we can freely admit Deuteronomy has a unique literary style. We can explain that in different ways. I would ultimately explain it in terms of Joshua recording the last speeches of Moses and having a kind of different style than the stuff that Moses wrote down earlier. But regardless of that, however you want to explain the difference in literary style, it is distinct. Deuteronomy has some things that it does habitually in terms of word choice and so on, and it's slightly different than Exodus through Numbers. But what you find in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel is you find verbal allusions or even outright quotations from, say, Leviticus side by side with verbal allusions and quotations from Deuteronomy.
Right.
They're just mixed together. So stuff that is in very distinct parts of the Pentateuch are synthetically pulled together and conflated or mixed in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And the problem with moving the Pentateuch after the prophets is, how the heck did these later authors untangle the mess that Jeremiah and Ezekiel create by combining laws and language from different parts of the Pentateuch?
Right.
Not only disentangle it, but disentangle it consistently, so that you'd have to say that some D author came along and pulled out all the so-called D stuff, and then a priestly author came out and pulled out the so-called P stuff without ever being contaminated by the D stuff.
Right.
And it's just absolutely absurd.
Absolutely. Yeah. To think a later author went and, very precisely cherry-picked certain text of the prophets without accidentally, incorporating any of the D material or the P material or whatever.
Yeah, it's
impossible.
It's a kind of a ludicrous literary compositional, scenario.
Right. All right, Dr. Bergsma, I want to go back to what you call the lack of Zion theology in the Pentateuch. That is, there's really no mention of Jerusalem, of, an emphasis on Judah, King David, all this stuff. And that there's actually more of an emphasis on northern sites,
Right.
you know, and it would play more into the hands of the Samaritans, who,
Right.
you know, the southern kingdom is in competition with
Right.
post-exile. And so that makes it even more unlikely to be a result of, you know, scribes or priests editing it during the exilic period.
Yeah. So let's recall what the exilic period is like. So the Jews come back from Babylon and they rebuild the city of Jerusalem and they settle in the area of Judah around Jerusalem. There is a rival group that also claims the heritage of Moses and of Israel to the north, a group that we come to call the Samaritans. That group claimed, and they actually did, descend from the northern 10 tribes. Okay, some parts of the Bible make it sound, kind of in a naive reading that like the northern territory was completely evacuated by the Assyrians in the year 721 and nobody was there. That's a bit of an exaggeration. We know that actually a lot of the poor farmers and so on of the northern tribes were actually left behind, and they intermarried with other groups that the Assyrian Empire brought into northern Israel, and that kind of mixed race community became known as the Samaritans, but they claimed to be the descendants of the northern tribes, and truly they were. At least they had, they had other blood in them, but they did have the blood of the northern tribes in them, especially of Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribes of Joseph. And it was particularly in the classical tribal territory of Ephraim and Manasseh that the Samaritans lived. So you have this rival religious community to the north, the Samaritans. They also claim the heritage of ancient Israel, and they have the Pentateuch. And surprise, surprise, the Pentateuch actually supports their claims better than it supports the claims of the Judeans, because Joseph is kind of the hero of the Pentateuch. Yep. And his sons get the blessing from Jacob. And so and his two tribes are the biggest. You combine them and they're bigger than Judah when you look at the tribes that wander through the wilderness. And Joshua comes from the tribe of Ephraim, and he's the last leader in the Pentateuch. And where they have their temple on Mount Gerizim, and that's where Deuteronomy, that's roughly the location where Deuteronomy says to ratify the covenant at the end of Moses' life, the commandments that he gives in Deuteronomy 11 and in Deuteronomy 26. He says to go to Ebal and Gerizim, these two hills. They're on either side of the city of Shechem, which was the capital of the Samaritans, and they had their temple on Mount Gerizim. So the Pentateuch really supports the claim of the rival Samaritans to the north. So how can we possibly imagine the Judean priests in Jerusalem concocting this document in, say, the 400s when it's why would they concoct a document that actually supports the claims of their rivals?
Right.
Now, many scholars now are recognizing this problem. So what's become popular is an idea that, the Samaritans and the Judean priests got together and they worked out a compromise document, and that's what the Pentateuch is.
Yeah.
Okay? There's so many problems with that. The first thing is, I'm like, well, that is convenient. My whole life, all the scholarship has been talking about how the Judeans and the Samaritans were at each other's throats when the Judeans came back from Babylon. Now, all of a sudden...
Now they're singing Kumbaya together.
Right. All of a sudden, when we need them to get along in order to save our theory, then we can make up that they were, like you say, that they were all sitting around the campfire singing Kumbaya. So how conveniently we can just radically change our reconstructions of history when it suits us to save a politically correct theory.
Right.
So there's that issue. The second issue is, it's just kind of absurd to think of, kind of like a committee, between these rival temples, both of whom are claiming to be the only proper place to worship the Lord, and what are we going to do? Shuttle, scholars back and forth and have them hammer out kind of like some kind of UN document. It's so modern. It's this kind of this modern anachronism like foisted back into this ancient period. And then the third major problem is, again, in this scenario put forward by Gary Knoppers and other scholars, we have this scenario where the Judean priests and the Samaritan priests are getting along and hammering out this document, and they come up with a compromise document. The problem is, it's not a compromise document. Like, it never mentions Jerusalem. It does mention Shechem,
right,
the capital of Samaria, a lot, and it gives a lot of value and dignity to the site of Shechem. And it mentions Gerizim, and it mentions Ebal, and it gives them a lot of dignity. It gives the primary glory to Joseph, and Judah gets some recognition, but he's definitely a secondary figure. So it's not a compromise. It's really a document that glorifies Joseph and the Josephite tribes. It kind of leaves Judah in, at best, just a secondary place. So you'd have to imagine a scenario in which the Judean priests cooperated in the construction of a sacred document that gave them a vastly secondary place in salvation history and gave all the glory to the Samaritan tradition to the north. And this is not historically plausible.
Right. Brilliant. So let me hit you with a possible objection that one may have. One may say, you know what, Dr. Bergsman, you got a good point. There's no Zion theology. There's no focus on Jerusalem or David or anything in the Pentateuch. But there is the theme of exile all over the place. You got the patriarchs in exile. You have Israel in Egypt. You can even go back to Genesis 2, where Adam is, put into this wonderful garden, which may be like a parallel to the Promised Land. He blows it. He's exiled out. What say you?
Yeah. Well, the theme of exile works in a lot of different social situations. There's a problem with what some scholars call pseudo-historicism. A tendency in biblical scholarship to say, because certain themes in the Bible could be put to theological or political purposes in a certain period in Israel's history, therefore the documents were written in that period in Israel's history. So the theme of the exile definitely is relevant to, say, the Judeans who've come back from Babylon and resettled their land, and they can say, hey, we were exiled because of our sins, and now if we want to keep our land, we need to obey the law. Well, sure, they can put that theme of exile to use in their context, but exile can also be put to use in other contexts. So in the early period of this early state formation of the people of Israel, when they have recently entered the land, the theme of exile works for them too, because it's like this. We have never had a land of our own. It's about time. And that's the same as how we see in the modern state of Israel. The theme of the Jewish diaspora of, since our temple was destroyed in the year 70, we've been wandering all over the world, and we haven't had a home in Europe, and we've been a displaced people, and we've been a marginalized and victimized people all through our history for the past 2,000 years. And so it's about time that we have a state of our own. Well, that kind of thinking is very much present, and it's politically vigorous in the modern state of Israel. And if we imagine the period of, say, the Judges or the Saulite kingdom or even the Davidic kingdom, the theme of exile in the Pentateuch of, we've been cast out, we didn't have a land of our own, we didn't get things right, but now we have it, and boy, do we deserve it, and now we've arrived, okay? That can really work for the political interests and the theological interests of that early period as well. So the mere fact that you have this exilic theme or this theme of exile running through the Pentateuch really doesn't tie you to a specific time period in terms of its composition. it's really relevant to a lot of different time periods. And indeed, it's relevant even to not just Israelites, but to Catholic Christians in the modern period. So Dr. Scott Hahn has just written a book, about Catholics in exile, how we don't really have a Catholic kingdom like France was, in the medieval period. There is no Catholic state. Catholics around the world find themselves in a kind of dispossessed, stateless situation. Mm-hmm. And so he picks up these themes of exile through Scripture and makes them, religiously relevant to Catholics. That does not mean that the Pentateuch was written by Catholics in the 21st century, right. So this is my point.
Sure.
And it's not just myself that that makes these points. Even mainstream scholars like Benjamin Sommer, I've heard his name also pronounced Sommet, who's written a lot on Isaiah and a wide variety of biblical topics, won awards for his books, etc. But he points this out, that you have these themes in Scripture that can be put to use in a wide variety of time periods, and it's a real mistake in biblical scholarship to just fixate on them and then say, oh, hey, we got proof that it was written after the exile or something.
Right. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, that is, we have other ancient Near Eastern texts that have doublets, that have different divine name usage.
Right.
And we're pretty sure they have one author too.
Exactly.
And these doublets and divine name usages, this is something the documentary hypothesis sees as evidence that, okay,
right.
They represent different authors that have now been mashed together.
Right.
The different divine names, you explain well. I mean, I can see how that would be the case. We talk about Jesus, Lord, Christ.
Uh-huh.
What about the doublets? I mean, like let's use the Noah story, for example, where the documentary hypothesis can be convincing, in that if you read the Noah story, it's like, wait a minute,
right.
There's different details and they seem kind of be like intermingled. What do you think would explain the doublets?
Right. Yeah. I think that the work of my good friend Joshua Berman, who's a rabbi and Bible scholar at Bar Ilan University in Israel, has been very instructive here, because Berman points out that a lot of modern biblical scholarship was anticipated by Muslim criticism of the Pentateuch that we already have in the medieval period. So you find, like in the 11th and 12th century, you've got figures like Ibn Hazm, who was a Muslim scholar in Moorish Spain, who, for various political reasons, really attacked the Jews and Jewish faith, and he applied a real strong critique to the Pentateuch. He read through the 5 books of Moses with, so to speak, the fine-tooth comb, noticed all kinds of purported problems with them. But interestingly, one thing that Ibn Hazm never has a problem with is these apparently repeated stories or double tellings of similar events, like twice in Genesis, there's accounts of God changing Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. That never bothers Ibn Hazm. Why is that? Well, because this kind of double tellings or repetitions was a common feature of classical Arabic literature. Just rolled right off his back. That's what you do. Okay, so I would say that the ancient readers and the ancient listeners to these epic stories found great satisfaction in a kind of stylistic repetition. And this was a literary technique used. I would argue it was a literary technique used especially in epic literature, especially in tales of kind of a grand stature. And I would say that this is the case with the flood narrative. The flood narrative is, obviously kind of the pace of the biblical narrative slows down when we get to the flood, and it's told with great care and with great literary artistry. And this has become evident in more recent scholarship. There's a famous book by the scholars Kikawada and Quinn from the 1980s where they take a look at many of the features of the Pentateuch, including the flood narrative, and they show that when you analyze it, you can see that there's what we call a chiastic structure to it. There's a balancing structure where the beginning and the end, the second and the second to last, and so on down to the middle of the story, all reflect one another. So I would say that in many parts of the Pentateuch, particularly important parts, the sacred author slows down and he tells the story with great literary artistry, who will often create literary balancing patterns. And these doublets arise because of this this affection that the ancient authors had for these chiastic or balancing structures, where the beginning and the end would balance and so on down to a midpoint. And so when you have like the third element and the third to last, you're going to get some repetition there. And the ancient listener was pleased by that. They're listening along and they can tell where they are in the narrative because they follow this sequence down to the midpoint of the story. And then they can tell when we're backing out, so to speak, and we're heading towards our conclusion because they're seeing repetitions from the earlier parts of the telling. And so it's the desire to satisfy that kind of literary expectation that we had in the ancient world that leads to these repetitions.
That makes complete sense. And there's actually chiastic structures that run throughout the entire Pentateuch. My Hebrew professor at UNCC, Dr. John Reeves, I don't know if you know him, he sent me some documents that show this, which, you know, for the documentary hypothesis, that would require some serious literary editing, right, of the different sources.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, one of the best books out there is by Gary Rensburg called The Redaction of Genesis. And it completely transformed my reading of Genesis. And indeed, it was Genesis that was kind of the playground that gave rise largely to the documentary hypothesis. But what Rensburg shows is these chiastic and other patterns that run through Genesis. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. And they're much more convincing, and they lead to, you know, insights into the literary structure, into what the sacred author is trying to convey, much more so than just viewing the Pentateuch as a jumble of these different sources. So I incorporated Rensburg's patterns that he observed into my book with Dr. Brant Petrie, my Catholic Introduction to the Bible, Old Testament. And it's led to a lot of fruit, actually. Led to hermeneutical insights into, you know, what are the main themes that the author is trying to convey.